Thank you very much, Ed. It's a pleasure to be here. The topic of the Middle East as a whole is an amazingly complicated one, and so I have written out some remarks in order to make sure that I do some minimal level of justice to it. And I will be brief and therefore superficial, but that's never bothered me in the least. And years ago, a wise man from the East told me that if something's worth doing, it's worth doing superficially. He lived on the east side over here. By now, it's widely accepted that U.S. influence in the Middle East is in something approaching free fall. The Arab uprisings of 2011 overthrew the governments in Tunis, Egypt, and Yemen, stimulated bloody miscalculations by both the Syrian government and its opposition, and destabilized Bahrain. They prompted greatly increased transfer payments to pacify the people of the conservative Arab Gulf monarchies, and midwifed their adoption of policies designed to evoke militarized nationalism. The aftermath of these events has been complex and confusing. It has not yet run its course. The Middle East kaleidoscope is still turning. The patterns it is creating are not auspicious for either the region's inhabitants or the United States. It is hard to make sense of a region that consists of family-run kingdoms, thugdoms, police states, military dictatorships, democratically directed ethno-religious tyrannies, and societies in near-Hobbesian states of nature. But unless we make the effort to do so, we risk exacerbating rather than mitigating the problems that the Middle East creates for the United States and our place in the world. Things may be getting better for women in some places, and religious extremism may be suffering a backlash. But overall, the trends are not favorable to American interests. They're complicated, and bear with me as I try to review them. The almost gleeful American abandonment of long-standing protégés like Egypt's Hosni Mubarak served to discredit America with the region's autocrats. In Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood won free elections only to demonstrate its socio-political narrow-mindedness, lack of economic vision, and incompetence at governing. Ballot box Islamism soon fell to a coup d'etat, which the United States then hypocritically refused to recognize as such. Americans joined Israel and the region's autocratic Sunni states in supporting the restoration of military rule in Egypt. The U.S. endorsement of the overthrow of Egypt's first freely elected government alienated the region's Democrats. No matter. The United States is no longer pushing the democratization of the Middle East or anywhere else. The European Union has also toned down its advocacy of human rights in the societies across the Mediterranean from it. The United States has fallen into a pattern of military-driven, diplomacy-free foreign policy in the Middle East. By contrast, astute uses of force by Russia in Syria, agile Russian diplomacy with Iran, Israel, Egypt, and Turkey, and Russian willingness to engage with all parties to disputes in the region have made Moscow the go-to power capital for major and minor actors there. But Russia's recent return to relevance in West Asia and North Africa does not mean that great power competition again drives events there as it did during the Cold War. In the 21st century, the traditional power centers in the Mashriq, the Arab East, Baghdad, Cairo, Damascus, have been supplanted by Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, with Tehran, Jerusalem, and Ankara playing some of the outsider roles in the Arab world that European imperialists and the United States once did. But the region's global strategic importance has not diminished. It's still where Africa, Asia, and Europe meet, a choke point for travel between the Indo-Pacific and the Mediterranean and Atlantic, the hub of the world's energy supply system, the location of important new capital markets, and where Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all originated. Awkward as it may be to deal with the Middle East, the world's great powers have no alternative to some degree of engagement with it. The challenge of such engagement is greatly complicated by the fact that regional actors have largely replaced their former passivity and fatalism with assertive pursuit of their national interests as they see them. Pan-Islamism earlier overtook Pan-Arabism as a potential organizing principle for the region. Now both Arabism and Islamism are yielding to notions of nationalism and Islam in one country, as in Tunis. Nationalism has taken hold even in Saudi Arabia, which long rejected it as verging on idolatry. Many, myself included, mistakenly supposed that the national identities of the countries defined in the 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement and its aftermath would dissolve as a result of the Arab uprisings. They have instead proved durable. The imprint of European colonialism on the Levant, Israel, Iraq, Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria has survived and even strengthened. But most countries in West Asia and North Africa no longer see much reason to defer to foreign patrons. Egypt, Iran, Israel, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, or UAE, pay lip service to the views of external powers like the United States, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, China, and India, whose support they traditionally courted and whose views they once took as guidance. They now proceed without regard to these patrons' interests or advice. Calculations by local actors about the region's geopolitical dynamics drive most of its antagonisms. But ideology, now almost exclusively in the form of theology, is still a significant factor. Secularism is in retreat. Aspirations for a democratic Islamism supported by Qatar and Turkey are under attack by a league of conservative Arab autocracies led by the UAE and including Egypt and Saudi Arabia. The Sunni Shia schism has intensified. Despite Iran's pretensions to leadership of Shia Islam, Shia outside Iran have for the most part rejected its theology of wilayat al-faqih, or clerical guardianship of the state. Sunnis are split between cosmopolitan moderates and hardline Salafis. America's catastrophically ill-considered military interventions in the region at the turn of this century laid low the traditional balancers of Iranian power in Afghanistan and Iraq. Related Israeli actions in Lebanon then elevated the Iranian-aligned Hezbollah, which is a quasi-fascist political party formed to resist the Israeli occupation of Lebanon in the early 80s. This was propelled to the commanding heights of Lebanese politics. External interventions both to overthrow the government and to bolster contending opposition factions in Syria helped devastate that country and reinforce its dependence on Iran and Russia. No longer constrained by external patrons, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE separately took actions that also inadvertently entrenched Iranian influence in Gaza, Bahrain, and Yemen. The United States has now effectively franchised our major regional clients in the Middle East, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, with the power to determine most American policies in their region. Washington has become stridently committed to these three countries' objective of regime change in Tehran. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have effectively set aside the issue of Palestinian relief from ongoing Israeli abuse and encroachment to focus on countering Iran's expanded political and military influence in the region. This has facilitated the formation of a previously unthinkable entente, a limited partnership for limited purposes, between the two Gulf Arab countries and Israel. Israel's primary concern has been less Iran's expanding sphere of influence in West Asia than the threat that Iran's alleged nuclear weapons program poses to Israel's nuclear monopoly in the region. Now, however, the presence of Iranian forces in Syria and their support of Lebanese Hezbollah increasingly alarm the Israelis. The Gulf states' limited partnership with Israel has gained them intelligence exchanges, new surveillance technologies, training and assassination techniques, and cooperation focused on combating the Iranian foe. Equally important from their point of view, it has enlisted the powerful American Zionist lobby in their support, giving them a near hammerlock on the U.S. Congress that their money could never buy. History's longest-running diplomatic deception, the so-called peace process in the Holy Land, has been superseded by an Israeli-dictated one-state, many-zones dispensation that demands Palestinian emigration or submission to the Zionist version of apartheid. American diplomacy toward Israel-Palestine has been placed firmly in the hands of ardent supporters of Jewish colonialism. The peace process has been reduced to a real estate mogul's notion of diplomatic maskarovka. This is a Russian term for an operational disguise that gains time for expanded Jewish settlement and ethnic cleansing of Arabs and their immigration or warehousing in projects. This has left Palestinians with no path to self-determination other than violence, compounding the potential for widening resort to terrorism on their part. Unconditional support from the United States for Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE has facilitated a series of unspeakable humanitarian disasters in West Asia, including Israel's quasi-genocidal siege of Gaza, the multinational vivisection of Syria, and the devastation of Yemen. Before Saudi Arabia carried out the gruesome murder of a dissident journalist in its consulate in Istanbul using techniques which are typical of Mossad, interestingly, it kidnapped the Lebanese prime minister and held him hostage. Each of these horrors invokes highly selective outrage abroad that generates blind spots to simultaneous atrocities elsewhere. Turkey and the Muslim world are obsessed with Gaza, Europe and Russia with Syria, and the United States is increasingly focused on Saudi unilateralism in Yemen and elsewhere. U.S. policies toward Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE directly or indirectly assist their military operations directed at terrorizing and immiserating the inhabitants of Gaza, the West Bank, and Yemen. Washington continues to violate Syrian sovereignty and to maintain a military presence on Syrian soil aimed in part at regime change. The United States is once again working toward abandoning the Kurds to their millennial Arab, Persian, and Turkish overlords. Taken together, these elements of U.S. policy leave it without any traction to speak of in the region, while severely eroding American moral standing outside it. A serious deterioration in U.S.-Turkish relations has exacerbated this decline in U.S. influence. This has consequences beyond the region. Turkish support or acquiescence is essential to the successful conduct of U.S. policies toward Iran, Iraq, Syria, Russia, Greece, Cyprus, Israel, the Balkans, the Black Sea region, the Caucasus and Central Asia, not to mention NATO, the European Union, and the Islamic world. Ankara can no longer be counted upon to back or facilitate U.S. diplomatic or military maneuvers. Turkey was, for a time, an inspiration to proponents of popular sovereignty in Egypt and elsewhere. Its political evolution appeared to demonstrate the feasibility of a democratic Islamist evolution to parallel the birth of Christian democracy in Western Europe. But the rise of Islamophobia in Europe has now made it clear that Muslim Turkey will never be accepted as European, Turkey's goal for the past 2 centuries. Rejected by Christendom, the Turks have turned away from Europe and toward the Middle East. In the process, they appear to have traded parliamentary democracy for presidential caudillismo, ruled by a demagogic populist strongman. Turkey continues in partnership with Qatar to support democratic Islamist movements in the region like the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas. But as in Turkey itself, the regional trend is toward less consolidative, more autocratic systems of government. In Saudi Arabia, Shura, or consensual decision-making, and oligocracy, ruled by the few, have given way to a form of monocracy, decision-making by a single person. In Israel, the free expression of ideas is ever more constrained by intensified ethno-religious identity politics that seek to reinforce the Jewish democracy's military dictatorship over its captive Arab, Muslim, and Christian populations. Fear of Islamist democracy and its consequences for the region's rulers has sparked the formation of an informal coalition of Sunni majority states committed to traditional Islamic systems of oligarchic government or to military autocracy. This development parallels the effort by European reactionaries to smother the revolutions of 1848, although it's so far been less successful. The United States and Israel are unashamedly aligned with this anti-democratic coalition. This and the decadence of contemporary American politics, on which I will not say anything further, have effectively deprived the United States of credibility as an advocate of the democratization of Muslim societies. But then, as noted, the U.S. no longer expresses much, if any, interest in this cause. Newly assertive UAE and Saudi policies have divided the Gulf Cooperation Council, which was created in 1981 to counter the Islamic Revolution in Iran. Oman now acts with little regard to the GCC. Kuwait has distanced itself from it. Emirati hostility to Qatar's alignment with the Muslim Brotherhood and unsuccessful Saudi efforts to compel Qatar to abandon its geographically dictated cordial relationship with Iran have cemented a Qatari partnership with Turkey. Qatar's new isolation in its own region has driven it to redouble its efforts to develop supportive relationships with great powers like China, India, Russia, and the United States. Meanwhile, the U.S. effort to isolate Iran and build a worldwide united front against it is failing. Last month's Warsaw Ministerial provided a convincing demonstration of U.S.-European disunity on Iran, as well as Chinese, Indian, and Russian opposition to the United States on the issue. It also illustrated the decline in American relevance to the principal issues in the Middle East, which are Israel-Palestine, the emergence of an Iranian sphere of influence, Syrian peace and reconstruction, the restoration of order in Yemen, domestic tranquility in the region's countries, and the faltering efforts of the Islamic world to reinvigorate itself as other previously great civilizations, for example, China and India, are visibly doing in the post-Western era. Vice President Pence's and Secretary of State Pompeo's recent tirades on Iran and the region's politics were music to the ears of Messrs. Netanyahu, Mohammed bin Salman, and Mohammed bin Zayed. They clearly struck Europeans, Asians, Africans, Turks, Arabs, and Persians as paranoid delusions, policies derived from media-manufactured hallucinations that bear little resemblance to conditions in the real world. The end of the Cold War's bipolar order liberated the world's nations and peoples from the constraints external patrons previously imposed on their independent action. After the Soviet Union's default on its rivalry with the United States and its subsequent collapse, Americans were left with no existential enemy. What to do? But the 9/11 terrorist attacks on New York and Washington demonstrated that in the post-Cold War world, the United States is no longer immune to reprisal by aggrieved parties overseas, especially in the Middle East, where American policies are widely resented. North Korea has shown that the way to be taken seriously by Washington is to be able to nuke it. Iran's potential to follow North Korea in acquiring the ability to strike targets in the American homeland now threatens to escalate the damage policy missteps in the region can inflict on us. The multinationally negotiated nuclear arms control agreement with Iran, the so-called JCPOA, mitigated this danger before it was repudiated by the United States in favor of pressures directed at regime change in Iran. But such efforts at regime change, once without risk to the American homeland, now entail potentially catastrophic costs to it. Drone warfare against others is beginning to be answered by drone warfare against American forces deployed overseas. How long before it's used against the United States itself? US and Israeli cyber attacks on Iran and others have already begun to be reciprocated by them. Hybrid warfare, whether Russian style, as in Crimea, or American style, as in Venezuela, could be applied to the United States as well as to others. Some think it already has been used to skew American elections. Israel has evolved by now a routine practice of so-called targeted killings as an alternative to diplomatic outreach to its ever more numerous enemies in the region. Such assassinations began by taking the lives of Western engineers assisting Arab countries to develop weapons that might be used against Israel. Israel then turned to culling the most promising leaders of the Palestinian resistance to Zionist occupation and settlement activity, thereby ensuring, as it wished, that it had nobody to talk to. In recent years, in association with US intelligence agencies, Israel has also engaged in the systematic murder of Iranian scientists and engineers. These operations have helped to erode previous standards of morality and international law on the global level. They invite imitation and reprisal. Since 9/11, the United States has spent, or committed to spend, almost $7 trillion on wars to control and contain trends and events in the Middle East. These diversions of tax revenues and borrowed capital to warfare abroad account in large measure for the deterioration of US physical and human infrastructure. None of these wars has achieved its objectives, none. Efforts to end them in the interest of cutting American losses, and I give President Trump some credit here, have been repeatedly frustrated by Washington warmongers. Now, even as the ability of the United States to control events and limit risks in the Middle East recedes, the potential impact on American domestic tranquility of developments there is increasing. At the same time, direct US interests in the region, other than the ability to transit through it, are on the wane. The United States rationale for protecting the world's access to Persian Gulf energy supplies reflects our self-appointment as the guardian of global order and prosperity. It is not a response to US domestic energy demand, which can again be met by a combination of domestic production and sources in the Western Hemisphere and West Africa. The United States is now an important energy exporter. In some respects, thanks to fracking, America has become the global swing producer of oil and gas. Meanwhile, the US Navy continues unilaterally to protect energy exports from the Middle East. The largest market for such exports is now China, an officially designated adversary of the United States. The second largest is India, a determinedly non-aligned nation. Under its new America First approach to foreign affairs, US alliances are increasingly troubled. Washington has charged its European and Asian allies with freeloading on our military power. American willingness to protect US Cold War allies and the health of their economies is on the ebb. I don't know if you've seen the latest proposals to charge cost plus for our protection of all of our allies. No one can now be sure how long the United States will remain committed to the unilateral guarantee of worldwide access to Persian Gulf energy exports that compete with its own. Iran remains deeply unpopular in the United States, but enthusiasm for war with it is limited to a few intensely partisan interest groups. The American people appear to have little appetite for more wars aimed at regime change in the Middle East, or the Muslim world more generally. Americans view both Israel and Saudi Arabia with increasing distaste. The ability of US client states in the region to buy support in Congress for their foreign policies does not buy such approval outside the Beltway. U.S. commercial interests in the Middle East have become less compelling. In the late 20th century, the United States was the largest exporter of goods and services to most countries in the region. Nearly half of U.S. arms exports still go there, but the U.S. no longer dominates civilian imports in the region. Almost everywhere, that distinction now belongs to China and the EU. The major U.S. focus in West Asia and North Africa has become counterterrorism. But this is based on the dubious theory that the best way to avoid being stung by hornets is to sidle up to their nests and poke them. Every indicator we have shows that the so-called global war on terrorism has multiplied rather than depleted the ranks of anti-American terrorists with global reach. That's not surprising, given the estimated 4 million Muslims who have perished from U.S. post-Cold War interventions in West Asia and North Africa. 4 million. Fighting terrorists over there just increases their numbers and encourages them to seek revenge here. It doesn't keep them at bay. The world's interests, including those of the United States, demand peace and stability in the Middle East and a reduction of the threats that emanate from it. Current U.S. policies do not serve these purposes. They prolong wars that debilitate the United States, disturb its and other nations' domestic tranquility, and corrupt the rule of law abroad as well as at home. America's expanding interventions in West Asia and North Africa are connected to no war termination strategies. Many in the United States have come to feel like the chorus on an ancient Greek stage, watching the protagonists march inexorably toward tragedies they cannot prevent. The usual Washington response to policy failure is to plus up the resources devoted to the failing policy and try harder. Doing this will not correct the trends the U.S. now faces in the Middle East. The United States needs policies that address and protect its interests more effectively than those it has been following. These policies should recognize the diminished stake Americans have in the Middle East, as well as our diminished influence there. They should realistically address and seek to leverage the diverse players now influencing the region, not proceed unilaterally. In this, we can learn from the Russians. Our military should support our diplomacy, not the other way around. We should be talking to all parties, not putting labels on some to rule out dialogue with them, as we've done with Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Iran. We should halt our feckless practice of convening peace conferences that exclude parties whose acceptance or acquiescence is essential to war termination. The main issues in the region of wider geopolitical importance remain Israel, Palestine, Iran's role, Israeli-Syrian enmity, refugees, the construction or reconstruction of war-torn societies, the war in Yemen, and the political orientation of Islam. These issues must be the focus of U.S. policy, but the United States no longer has the capacity to go it alone in addressing them. American diplomacy must be redesigned to advance U.S. interests by joining the power and capabilities of others to America's own. Even if Israel were prepared to countenance Palestinian self-determination, which it manifestly is not, it has succeeded with great misguided effort in making the two-state solution infeasible. There is now effectively one state in Palestine. In that state, Zionism has supplanted Judaism as a state ideology. An assertively Zionist minority rules over both devout Jews and three categories of Arabs: second-class Arab citizens of Israel, the disenfranchised and persecuted in the militarily occupied Palestinian territories, and the constantly terrorized inhabitants of the great open-air prison of Gaza. Call this apartheid, if you will. In many ways, it's worse than the South African version because it denies the oppressed any hope of development, separate or otherwise. The Israel-Palestine issue is now one of equal civil and human rights within a single polity. Resolving it requires a moral and political, not a physical revolution. The movement to boycott, divest from, and sanction Israel, BDS movement, is a global reaction to Israel's self-delegitimization, but it misses the point. Domestically dictated American subsidies to Israel, not trade and human intercourse with it, are the principal enabler of Zionism's racist cruelty to Palestine's indigenous inhabitants. The key to ending that cruelty is to end American official and private endowment of it. Given the way the U.S. political system now franchises interest groups with the formulation and administration of policies of primary concern to them, that will not happen until a new generation of Jewish Americans collectively determines it must. Until then, Israel's moral decay and departure from the values of Judaism will continue, and its international unacceptability increase. That means American Jews in the United States will be held ever more accountable for Israeli actions with which most profoundly disagree and of which they disapprove. Both domestic anti-Semitism and foreign anti-Americanism will intensify. Current U.S. policy toward Iran consists of a mixture of ostracism, propaganda to demonize the Islamic Republic, economic pressure for regime change, and threatened military assault. But without talking to Iran, the United States can constrain neither its nuclear program nor its policies in its region. Name-calling and economic pressure reinforce Iran's hardliners and retard reform and opening to the outside world that could curtail Iran's militancy and create a basis for its peaceful coexistence with its neighbors. Threats of military attack stimulate it to seek an effective deterrent in the form of the capability to conduct a nuclear strike on Israel and the United States. Of course, it's only better to talk than not to talk if you know what you're going to say. And before we talk to Tehran, the United States needs a multinationally concerted strategy for a course of negotiation that can address American, Israeli, and Gulf Arab concerns about Iran's current behavior and potential future threat to regional order and to the United States itself. Similarly, to deal with jihadism, refugees, and reconstruction in Syria, as well as with Syria's role in Lebanon and its conflict with Israel, will require dealing with the government in Damascus. Whatever Americans, Europeans, Gulf Arabs, Israelis, and Turks may think of it. Trends and events, including some that are the product of self-contradictory U.S. objectives in Syria, overthrow the government, overthrow the movement directed against the government at the same time. These contradictory policies have made it necessary to include Iran and Russia in any discussion of how to realign Syria, repair its human losses, and rebuild it. And China's going to have to be invited to play a role in Syria's rehabilitation and reconstruction, too. Syria has illustrated the limited ability of great power military intervention to reshape the complexities of local politics. Yemen demonstrates that the same limits apply to regional actors as well. The war there has become not just a calamity for Yemenis, but a burden and an embarrassment to most of its foreign backers. The only winner in Yemen so far is Iran, which has acquired an unprecedented level of influence there. The sooner the external parties, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the United States, can extricate themselves, the better, not just for them, but for the people of Yemen. Finally, U.S. policy must recognize that the Dar al-Islam, the Islamic world, is in a crisis quite as profound as that which tormented Christendom before the Enlightenment. Radically competing visions of its future are in contention. The ability of non-Muslims to influence the outcome of the debate within Islam is limited. But non-Muslims have a big stake in whether the result is an affirmation of the tolerance Islam once exemplified, or of aggressive medievalism and ostentatious religiosity coupled with hypocrisy. The United States must take care to avoid tipping the struggle in the wrong direction. And this will require a kind of empathy for the Islamic faithful that is not currently in evidence in our country. The trouble with kaleidoscopes is twofold. When you give them an ignorant knock, the pieces rearrange themselves in unpredictable ways. And when you fail to turn them, the pieces remain in their current configuration, whatever that might be. The United States needs to cease banging the Middle East kaleidoscope and start working with others to produce realignments in the region that serve American interests, not those of American client states or third parties. Thank you. That ends the lecture.
We have some time for questions, comments. I'll turn. Yeah.
Jazz, you've done a masterful job of summarizing a very complex situation over a large piece of real estate stretching from West Asia to North Africa, as well as making some very insightful suggestions for guidelines that the United States should follow in its policies. But I want to focus in on Iraq, Syria, and the Kurds, and ask you specifically what we should do there. Trump has announced a troop withdrawal, total troop withdrawal, which has now walked back a bit. But given your aversion to military intervention, what do you think specifically we should do with Iraq, Syria, and the Kurds?
In Iraq, we have sponsored the creation of an autonomous region that meets most of the requirements for an independent state, other than recognition. No one will recognize it as an independent state for the simple reason that that would trigger Turkish and Iranian as well as Arab Iraqi intervention in the state. So Iraqi Kurdistan is well served by the legal fiction that it's fully part of Iraq. And I don't think anybody challenges that, including the Turks, who have managed to turn it into a bit of a satellite in many respects. Syria is different. There, the Kurds have been concentrated in an area along the Turkish border. These Kurds are affiliated with the PKK within Turkey, which has long been engaged in a struggle for self-determination that has involved a lot of terrorist acts and is quite naturally anathema to whoever was in charge and whoever might be in charge in Ankara. I think encouraging that group to maintain a fully autonomous position in Syria, similar to the one that the Kurds have achieved in Iraq, is likely to result in tragedy for them and for everybody else. And so I think withdrawal is the correct policy. I think President Trump deserves credit for seeing that. However, it should be accomplished as a result of a set of considered judgments about how to minimize the damage and facilitate the adjustment to new circumstances. And that means discussing this with Damascus, Ankara, Moscow, as well as the Gulf Arabs who have their own equities there. I would say perhaps the most difficult discussions that need to be held are those with Jerusalem, because, as you know, I have tried to work out a sort of taxonomy of relationships between independent actors in international affairs, and one of those is a protectorate, which is a country that you wish to see survive, not because of any reason other than that it is strategically advantageous to have it where it is. It's sort of what the U.S. did with China in World War II. As long as they were indigestible to the Japanese Empire, they served a purpose and we were willing to help them. Well, there's an opposite to that, and I don't know what the name ought to be, which is a country you want to splinter, weaken, and incapacitate. And Israeli policy towards Syria has followed that path. That is, it's been in the Israeli interest, as Israelis have seen it, to divide Syria along ethnic and other lines, and preferably to destroy the Syrian state. So the Israelis, behind the cover of all the chaos in Syria, have been very involved with some of the worst Islamist jihadi groups, and they've also been involved, of course, with the Kurds, as they are in Iraq. So, for the same reason, basically. So that is a difficult discussion, but it's one we have to have. So I thought President Trump was right. I think his advisors pulling him back were wrong. But there should have been a discussion prior to the decision. It shouldn't have just been the product of a tweet following a discussion with Mr. Erdogan, who is off his meds these days. So I think that's the best I can do on that question.
Question? Yeah.
So, hi, my name is Kevin Simon Jr. I just wanted to ask you a question about ISIS and how recently it's been confined into Baghuz, and a lot of people think that it might be the end of ISIS per se, but also in the Philippines there's been new, some kind of, new groups that arose from ISIS, and some people might just think that it can't just eradicate an ideology per se, but it can move towards new regions and roots over that. So what do you think the West, and by the West I mean Europe, the US, I guess what we could call the developed world, how they, like the countries that are involved in the fight against ISIS, what can they do to prevent the radical Islamic ideology from not just being stopped in the Middle East and then moved, but just being eradicated in its group?
Well, the difference between, we have many names for this thing. Daesh is the Arabic name for it, and ISIS and ISIL refer to the locality. It never was intended as the caliphate, which it calls itself. It never was intended as a locality. So what's different between this group and other Salafi jihadi groups is that they came to the conclusion they needed a territorial base, which they achieved. I mean, they actually were ruling an area that was significantly larger than the UK at one point. But you're right; it's an ideology, not a state per se, even if it briefly took on the characteristics of a state. So crushing it, as we appear to be doing with mostly Syrian forces attacking the remnant of the so-called Islamic State, is not going to destroy it. And of course, you mentioned the Philippines. That is not the only region where the metastasis is occurring. It's much more acute in Central and West Africa. Boko Haram in Nigeria, the whole Chadian basin basically is now full of groups inspired by the Islamic State. Southern Thailand also, and there are dangers elsewhere. And this goes to the point I was making about the contentions within Islam over what the identity of Islam is or should be. The one extreme is the sort of medieval-minded people who founded the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq. This is a sort of a personal thing, I guess, but I think it's interesting, and it illustrates a lost opportunity. I don't think we can answer this from the West, per se. We need allies We need partners among major Muslim actors. And in Saudi Arabia, the late King Abdullah was such a potential partner because he came up with a brilliant scheme for co-opting the Salafi jihadis. He said basically, and of course he spoke with some authority because of his custody of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. He said, you know, you're right. We live in a morally corrupt age. Our religion is full of hypocrisy. We need to purify. We need to revive it. We need to revitalize it. And you're absolutely right. The way to do this is to look back to the beginnings of Islam, to early practices, the so-called Salaf, or the followers of the Prophet Muhammad. You're all entirely correct about that. Where you're fundamentally wrong is what early Islam was. It was not intolerant. Jews and Christians served as prime ministers in the early Muslim empires. It was not xenophobic. It incorporated Greek thought, preserved it, and eventually retransmitted it to Europe, causing the Renaissance. It was not misogynist. Women played an independent role, not just in private spaces, but in public spaces. The Prophet Muhammad's wife ran her own caravans as a businesswoman up to Damascus from Mecca, for example. And so he said, yes, let's look at the early practices. Oh, and finally he said, Islam has a distinction, he said, maybe it's true, maybe not, that of the three Abrahamic religions that Islam is the summary of, Islam is the only one that directs its followers to investigate God's handiwork and understand it. So Islam is a religion of science, and that is why early physics, chemistry, astronomy, maths, algebra, and so on, were pioneered in something called the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, first in Damascus, then in Baghdad. So that was a vision that tore the rug out from under the extremists, and we could have aligned with it. We've had another opportunity, and that was when the Turks appeared to be developing something like Christian democracy within the Islamic world. And I don't know, people probably take Christian democracy for granted, but in the 19th century in Europe it was considered a logical impossibility. How could a democratic movement associated with the autocratic Catholic Church exist? The contradiction between the Pope, the most autocratic, infallible person around, and democracy was irreconcilable, people thought. And yet it happened. So we might have worked there. There's an irony now. I was talking to Ed about it a little earlier. What's happening in Xinjiang in Western China, which is brutal effort at re-engineering a culture by the Chinese, has worked out, has given Mr. Erdogan the opportunity to contest leadership of the Sunni world with the Saudis. Because Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, went to Beijing and said nothing about this except excuses. And of course the Turks, being related to Uyghurs and Kazakhs and others who are affected by these policies, Kyrgyz, other Turkic peoples, have seized on it as a means of asserting moral leadership within the Dar al-Islam. There are lots of cross currents here, but we need to find Muslim allies whom we can support. There are such people. We have a tendency to get off on tangents and we don't take those opportunities. Yes.
I had mentioned to Chaz that in my own scheduling confusion, I thought this event ended at 5.
It doesn't.
It looks like there are a number of questions. I'm going to have to run off in a moment, so my apologies, but we'll just keep the questions going until...
First, thank you for making us think about something that most of us don't have the stomach to think about.
pretty awful.
It is pretty awful. But if I read you right, and looking past Trump, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the single most important signal that America could give that it's changing its position would be the withdrawal of subsidies to the state of Israel. Is that kind of the starting proposition for any repositioning?
Yeah, I think that's correct. There is a distinction between what we do in Yemen, which is objectionable, and what we do with Israel in Gaza and on the West Bank. And the distinction is that the Saudis pay us to give them support. We pay the Israelis to do the awful things they do, which gives us a higher level of responsibility, accountability, if you will. But nobody wants to talk about this. It is, if you're a politician, it guarantees support for your opponent in any political context, generous support, as well as vituperation against you. Who needs it? So people just don't talk. And as long as the Zionist lobby is as strong as it is, that's going to be the case. Therefore, I'm not holding my breath, waiting for intelligent U.S. policies on that or many other issues in the Middle East. But there are lots of things that we need to think about. We might actually try to develop a strategy and then support it politically with diplomacy and back the diplomacy with force, rather than having a military campaign that we have to invent diplomacy to support, and treating the diplomatic service as the cleanup squad after we've banged around and knocked over a lot of things and made a mess, which is pretty much what we've been doing. Yep, please.
Yes. Are there in the Congress or the top level of the government people who are really know about all these issues in an open-minded way that would be, kind of thinking in the line that you are talking about in a very frank way? I mean, because we live in the New York Times, we are in the Washington Post, I'm in the newspaper that explains the situation, and then we end up with things that make absolutely no sense and are actually quite dangerous right now at the government level. So are they, you said you are not very hopeful about any improvement. Have you found among your contacts people who really
Oh, they certainly are. There certainly are people who are very thoughtful and have ideas that are unconventional and are prepared to speak them. But they're not in positions of power, and they don't tend to be elected officials. Now, we have a new group in the Congress, Ilhan Omar and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and what's her name, Tlaib from Midwest, who are unafraid on these issues, which is refreshing. They've opened some space for discussion, but that's all it is. So far, there's not much discussion. There's a lot of diatribe. We have all these issues tend to, in the end, become domestic political questions. For example, the question of Yemen and our role there immediately takes you to the U.S. Constitution, where Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11 gives the U.S. Congress the exclusive power to authorize wars of choice. And we are co-belligerents in Yemen. But the Congress has never authorized anything. There has been a growth of executive power, congressional power, from the Korean War, which was undeclared, right up to the present day. Congress has defaulted on its power, failed to exercise it. So the controversy over Yemen is now pushing people who were previously, many liberals who were previously oblivious to or indifferent to the constitutional arrangements that we're supposed to live under, has been pushing them to become interested in restoring the constitutional balance of power and checks and balances that we've lost. So there are trends toward a more balanced approach that's more consistent with American values and with our traditions, but they're trends, they're not yet facts.
If there were a change in 2020, there would be a change.
I have no idea what's going to happen in 2020. I can only say that I'm probably the only person you'll ever meet who's not running for president.
Too bad.
Do you expect global shifts away from fossil fuels and towards more renewable sources of energy to shift the domestic political economy and political economy within the Middle East and consequently U.S. intervention into, I suppose, specifically members of OPEC? And if so, how?
Well, certainly the major members of OPEC, Saudi Arabia specifically, or the UAE, both of which are very large producers of oil and gas, and Iran for that matter, all anticipate a need to restructure their economies not to be dependent on hydrocarbon exports. And in the case of the Saudis, there are two very ambitious plans. I'm never sure when I'm dealing with the Saudis whether they will actually implement what they talk about. But both the nuclear program and solar, which of course makes a great deal of sense in Saudi Arabia. The natural material for silica is what most of the sand there is made out of. And the intensity of the sun's rays is about 3 times that in California, where solar energy is now very competitive economically. So there's a big shift in the region to move into non-hydrocarbon sources of energy. And so, but there will always be a role for hydrocarbons. Just because they're easily transportable, they're very efficient if the engines that use them are correctly designed. And so, but it will be a diminished role over time. Probably transportation will be the last to go. Although electric vehicles are coming in, something's going to have to generate the electricity, and in order to go into the electric vehicles. Unfortunately, the United States is not the leader in this area, notwithstanding Elon Musk and Tesla. China's the leader, and both in the installation of solar and wind power, and in electric vehicles. I guess that's because it's kind of hard to put a dead buck in the back of your Tesla and drive. We like to hunt in this country, but I'm not sure whether that's the explanation.
Does Jordan have a role in any of this?
Yeah, it's a buffer state for everybody. Nobody really is very fond of it, but nobody feels they can do without it. It's a buffer between Israel and Iraq, between Syria and parts of Israel, Syria and Saudi Arabia. And after the Gulf War, there was a lot of discussion in the region about whether it should just be abolished, because King Hussein was on the side of Saddam Hussein. No relation. But they were talking about the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan and the Republic of Iraq were discussing a unification scheme for 3-4 months after the invasion of Kuwait. It went on. Anyway, apparently Saddam had promised King Hussein he could have Mecca back. And well, Saddam would keep the oil fields, but he'd give the holy part of it to King Hussein. So not an active role, but it's just a strategic zone of denial that is very convenient to everyone. And at the moment, greatly tortured by Syrian refugee presence, on top of the previous Palestinian refugee presence.
Something about the events in, right now in Algeria. It's just now very unsettled.
I'm not following Algeria closely. I'm aware that the geezer president, and I use the term advisedly, being one myself, is intent on staying in for a fifth term. Sort of.
Officially
Today? Oh, good. Hallelujah. But no, Algeria's had a terrible time getting its independence and then since independence with all sorts of violent politics, which hasn't gone away. Yeah, it's getting better. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned that as there's a backlash in the United States about our whole protecting Israel, sort of cleaning up after some of its actions in the Middle East. You mentioned how there are certain new politicians that have come in onto the stage in 2018 and are unafraid to criticize our role behind Israel. Do you see the growing partisanship over how much we're going to support Israel as a problem, or
Yeah.
do you see this partisanship increasing in future years, or as a
I think the fact that Mr. Netanyahu in particular has become so identified with the right wing of the Republican Party is a very dangerous thing for Israel. Because Israel was not a partisan issue in the United States. Now it is. And you can see this in the political polling. There's all sorts of things going on that issue. There are many Jews, American Jews, who, beginning years ago with the Not in My Name movement and continuing to the present day, now draw a sharp distinction between their own faith and Jewish identity and Zionism, which is something different. And so it doesn't help when Mr. Netanyahu says, as he said 2 days ago, that Israel is a state for the Jews only, and Arabs basically are, inconsequential. Because this confirms a lot of the objections that there's no American Jewish community, but American Jewish communities have to the state of Israel. And, it's all bringing out an interesting phenomenon, and that is traditionally American Jews were anti-Zionist. They became Zionist only in the 1950s. And a big time after the '67 war. And I think the balance is being restored. So that is a danger to the state of Israel as well, and it's all the consequence of Israeli policies. Israel is jeopardizing its essential support in Europe and the United States, in Jewish communities outside Israel. 20% of Israelis have emigrated. If you go to Berlin, there's a huge Israeli colony there. It never would have occurred to me that could happen in my lifetime. I don't know where all this is going, but it's clearly not going in favor of Zionism. Yeah, one more. Then we should adjourn, I think.
I just have a question in relation to the African continent and how the threats that you've been describing in the Middle East and how the U.S. has kind of meddled with everything that has been going on there for the past decades, and how I guess Europe is quite influenced, especially Great Britain and France, think the role of Western countries is reduced? Like, is it positively reduced recently, or is there some kind of
In Africa?
yeah, like how
Hmm.
how this influence can shift towards something more productive, so that the African continent, and I guess obviously I'm talking in generalities and it's much more complicated than that, but how these influences can contribute to something better.
Well, European colonialism left Africa in a very potentially unstable condition. The boundaries of states bear no resemblance to local geography or ethnography. Peoples are split between countries. And so far, however, the Africans have managed, with the exception of Eritrea and South Sudan, to preserve the boundaries that they inherited from European colonialism. But and certainly in the Francophonie there is a lot of French intervention still in Africa. I don't see that. You don't see that in the Lusophone countries, the Portuguese-speaking countries. Spain has nothing to do with Guinea Equatorial, and the British are not interventionist in Africa particularly, although they've played a helpful role diplomatically in some instances. What's new is the arrival of Asian and Latin American presences. Brazil, a very big presence in particularly Southwest Africa, Angola, in Cabo Verde, in Guinea-Bissau, in Mozambique. The Chinese, of course, everywhere. There are now 3 million or more Chinese living in Africa, most of them small business people who've emigrated there and have no intention of going home. And Indians. India is now a big factor, as is Japan. Turkey, which had not been much of a factor in Africa, is now very, very active there. I think in the last 5 years, they've established 18 new embassies in Africa. And UAE and Saudi Arabia and others are also very active, as is Iran. So that the Africans now have multiple choices before them in terms of where they can do business, with whom they can consult, and whose support they can gain. The United States has never been big in Africa, really. We are a significant presence just because we're a global power. But anyway, the whole African situation in terms of external relationships is just becoming more and more complicated, giving Africans more and more choices, which I think is good. Final point is that colonialism has been replaced by, and official development assistance programs which succeeded have largely been replaced by investment on a commercial basis, whether it's Chinese or Indian or Japanese or American or European. It's now on terms negotiated by Africans for their own benefit. That is something new. Islam is a great force in Africa, and becoming a greater one, by the way, quite aside from extremists in Nigeria. I think Ed skipped out, which is set a good precedent, and so I think we can adjourn this, and appreciate your being here.